George Kalogeris in Greek, is a professor of English literature and classics in translation, and is co-director of the Poetry Center at Suffolk University in Boston. He's published 3 books of poetry. The first was a book of poems on the notebooks of Albert Camus, entitled Camus, Carnets. The second was Guide to Greece, and his most recent work is Winthropos. In 2012, he published Dialogos, paired poems in translation. George has received various accolades and awards, including the 5 Points 2018 James Dickey Prize for Poetry, and his work was selected by Christopher Ricks for the anthology Joining Music with Reason. George is a channel between a world gone by, an old world that no longer exists in the old world, and a pocket of immigrant New England that has also shapeshifted. He brings it all along with him, held in memory, yet embodied in the present. He draws on the echoes of the world of his parents and his ancestors in southern Greece, the blending and collisions of the old world at home and the new world out and about, and somehow reconnect some dots in between, with Ritsos, Seferis, and Cavafy gently resounding, and dips further back still into our roots in antiquity as a scholar of the classics. In his review of George's most recent collection, Dominic Knowles, referring to the echoes of Ritsos in George's work, writes, George Kalogeris is not a political poet, but like Ritsos, his attention to poetic speech emerges from a place of deep struggle and historical memory. He's been mentored and spurred on by poets David Ferry, Derek Walcott, Fred Marchand, and others, and in turn has mentored and encouraged many more through his long teaching career and his sustained presence in the poetic community. On the back cover of Winthropos, we read Rosanna Warren's eloquent tribute. George Kalogeris' idiom and cadence flow from Homer through Seferis and Cavafy and his immigrant parents' Greek into a poetry of eerie, timeless freshness in English. Redolent of honey and dark wine, his lines make an enchanted space where the dead and the living commune, where we cannot tell mourning from celebration, a breathtaking performance. George, welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter. I cannot express how much I respect the important work that Vassiliki and Peter are doing for Greek American poetry. And I also want to thank our tech wizard, Bilal Soel. I'm going to start. And the other thing I wanted to say about Peter and Vassiliki is that they're fellow poet translators. And that means a great deal to me. I want to start with a poem called The Evening Star. And Peter and Vassiliki have translated into Greek. So I think Peter will read it in Greek after I read the English version. The Evening Star. I boarded the Blue Line at Aquarium Station. The only empty seat was the one by that young, head back, eyes closed, exhausted-looking father, holding his sleeping child in his folded arms. It was already supper time, and the evening star, as Sappho sings, was calling all of the creatures home to their mother through the rush hour traffic. Subway was coming out of the tunnel's mouth, And I was 60 when I suddenly felt a tiny hand start pulling at my sleeve. In his sleep, the child I never had was reaching out for me, while the father I never became kept his eyes shut. And all the way to my stop at Orient Heights, nothing disturbed our dream.
Αποσπερίτης. Μπήκα στην κιανή γραμμή στο σταθμό του ενιδρίου. Η μόνη θέση ήταν πλάι σε εκείνον τον νεαρό, με το κεφάλι προς τα πίσω και τα μάτια κλειστά, εξαντλημένο πατέρα, κρατώντας το κοιμισμένο παιδί του στον κόρφο του. Ήταν ήδη η ώρα του δείπνου και ο Αποσπερίτης, καθώς ψάλλει σαπφό, καλούσε όλα τα πλάσματα στη φωλιά της μάνας τους μέσα στην κίνηση σε ώρα αιχμής. Το τρένο ξεπρόβαλε από τη σύραγγα στο στόμιο και εγώ ήμουν 60 ετών όταν έξαφνα ένιωσα να τραβά το μανίκι μου ένα χεράκι μικρούλικο. Στον ύπνο του, το παιδί που ποτέ δεν απέκτησα άπλωνε το χεράκι του προς εμένα, ενώ ο πατέρας που ποτέ δεν έγινα κρατούσε τα μάτια του σφαλιχτά. Και μέχρι το σταθμό μου στα Orient Heights, ατάραχο παρέμεινε το όνειρό μας.
Thanks enormously, Peter. That was beautifully read. Basil. Sometimes on Sundays, while we were still asleep, my father blessed the house with a basil leaf and a little glass half filled with holy water. The sprig was from our next door neighbor's garden, and the holy water seemed no different to us than faucet water, although it came from church, in clear plastic tubes that looked like medicine bottles when they were filled with light on the kitchen sill. Most times I'd wake up just in time to see him pass down the hall, dipping the sprig in a glass as he sprinkled every doorway in the house, repeating something in Greek I couldn't follow. Some phrase he muttered quickly under his breath each time the sprig would break the water's surface. And then I was seeing through a glass so clearly, even the veins of the leaf stood out from a distance. Before I knew it, the whole house smelled of basil. You could count your blessings in the sunlit dew cast off so lightly, but never nonchalantly by the leaf in his right hand. As if you were struck by the morning glimmer left on everything the water happened to touch, drawing a bead on the dilating bead that brightened the bureau's brass handle and kept you focused on the here and now, until a later date when the priest would perform the very same ritual all over again, but this time stopping at the threshold of the altar where the sleeper refused to wake. Do we call the glass half empty, or is it half full? The answering voice breaks off between the verses, Vassiliki. My tongue curls back on its stem like a wet leaf, companion to low chanting. I'm going to read a couple of poems in this reading today about sort of fellow sufferers. One of them is my mother, who suffered from Alzheimer's. And this poem is called Baby Monitor. She's sound asleep, or her Alzheimer's is. I can hear each breath she takes through the monitor I keep on my desk, hooked up as it is to the one upstairs beside her bed. The kind of listening device that's used for keeping track of infants. The tremulous speaker could fit in the palm of your hand. A little green light pulses every time it picks up any trace of my mother's voice. Babble of baby talk and muffled whimpers. Those garbled bits expelled from her speech machine. Its plastic speaker propped all night on its stand, calling out softly some rhythmical, ruminant something, so automatic it might be dreaming out loud in my mother's oblivious voice. A Sibylline machine that makes the incomprehensible clear. And please help her, and please guide him, and stop it from spreading from the kidney to the kidneys, please, dear Lord, and make that enough to meet their mortgage payments. I'm privy to a prayer that no one else can hear, at least tonight. Some primal psalm where all are nameless, but none of them forgotten. And please, and please, and please goes the little green pulsing light. Peter mentioned a book of translations that I did, Dialogos. And because of what's going on in Ukraine, I thought it was right to read my version of a poem by Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian Jewish poet who died in the Gulag. And I think this poem was directed back at Stalin. And I think from the dead, it's directed back at Putin. Mandelstam, as I was washing myself in the dark. As I was washing myself in the dark, washing outside where the ice cold water kept spilling over the rim of the barrel. The evening stars against the horizon glisten like salt on the blade of an axe. As I was washing myself in the dark, I saw the locked gate that couldn't keep out the menacing look of my surroundings. Once it had entered my state of mind. Soon the weavers will weave a new pattern from anything they can get their hands on, looming there in the near future. No matter what fabric they happen to stitch, I don't think the seams will ever be finer than a single line of honest speech. Salt of the earth and stars of the sky, dissolving now in the water's reflection, this briny water that keeps turning blacker, like some purer shade of appalling death, as if our lips had already tasted what's steeped in the salt of worsening luck. As I was washing myself in the dark, washing outside where the ice cold water kept spilling over the rim of the barrel, the earth edged closer to truth and terror. I want to read something in a very different tone. There's a kind of ancient antagonism between the Athenians and the Spartans, and that's kind of relived in this poem. It's called Berlitz, School of Language. It's Vrisi, not Vrishi, my teacher of modern Greek, who came from modern Greece, corrected me. Her accent was subtle, her English, British, but her inflection of the demotic word for fountain lacked the shiny, sibilant splash I always heard whenever one of the elders said, Vrishi. Backwater speech that kept going back to its source. Village springheads whose rustic mountain tongue still sang to us from the mouth of our kitchen faucet. I was a graduate student taking a quick refresher course when I complained to my mother about her pronunciation. Her people were Spartan. She stood by the sink. And where in Greece is she from, this teacher of yours? And when I say Athens, it's Athens, dismissed with a wave of her laconic hands. Oh, I knew it. Then again, the sibilant gush of Vrishi, as fluent as faucet water, washing over the stack of stucco white dishes. I just want you to have some sense of what the poems look like on the page, and to say a few things about it after I read this poem, which is called Hades. Hades, of course, being the underworld and Greek myth. Hades. I was trying to hit with a rock, a paper kite. My taunting cousin was flying above our yard, but struck instead our black DeSoto's windshield. And now my mother stands by the stove, arms akimbo, but face beseeching him to go easy. Just home from work, but still in his butcher's apron, my father kneels before me. Look me here. I lift my head, beholden to what his index finger won't let me avoid. Those disappointed eyes of my immigrant father, who never struck me, but whose old world admonitions always left me badly shaken, as if I betrayed his grave injunction, you, my right hand. But this time he winks and says instead, do you like Mama to make for you a baby sister, Yorgo? I think I nodded my head, then ran outside, but not before I heard my mother's shriek of sheer elation's laughter, sunlit and soaring. Sometimes in dreams, my father grips my shoulder. Look me here, he says, his glasses obscured by smoky grease from the meats or the filth of Lethe. And you, my right hand, so many errant throws, but only one that cracks with a rock our black DeSoto's windshield and lets me hear their laughter. My parents down there, where nothing breaks the silence. Just wanted to say a couple things about this. There's a number of poems I have. My father had a little grocery store. And I know my fellow poet in the audience, Nick Ratiotis' parents also had a little grocery store. And a lot of the poems, a number of poems come out of that experience. I think the thing I wanted just to call a little bit of attention to here is that most of the poems I write are written in meter, some version of iambic pentameter or tetrameter. But I particularly wanted to keep the steady 5-beat line all the way to the end, so that that end line, my parents down there where nothing breaks the silence, goes to 6 beats, which is the ancient hexameter line, the Homeric line. And that's the line that's trying to go to the underworld. And parents are on one end of the line and silence is on the other, and there's a kind of rhyme. And also, I think, as a sort of writer who grew up where, I was listening to 2 languages and a lot of broken English, I think on occasion that broken English can be a very rich source. I use it only sparingly, but when my father said, "You, my right hand," it allows me to address my writing hand. You, my right hand. And I wanted to sort of relive that moment in the poem of cracking the windshield, which breaks the silence and lets me hear my parents' laughter. So thank you for attending to that. Let's go on to the next one. I want to go to a poem that's a bit longer, and I need to say some words of explanation. It's called RCA Victor. My father and his two brothers left their village way, way up in the Peloponnesos, tiny village of Archivos in Arcadia, when he was 15. His father was here in America working as a laborer. The war broke out a few years later. My father found himself in the Philippines, and his mother was alone in Archivos. Well, she had her two daughters, but all of the men were gone, and the Nazis, for some reason, went all the way up to that village and made her house the headquarters. Now, there's a story here. It's characteristic of stories of that generation, that post-World War II generation, particularly immigrants, where it's hard to tell what the facts were and what's apocryphal. But the youngest brother, my father's brother, Costa, Charlie, swore to me on his deathbed that the Nazis had killed his mother. And the story was that his mother loved music. And there's a lot of music in my family. It was a musical family in ways. They loved their dramatic songs. But he sent his mother a Victrola. And according to my uncle, because my grandmother's house, the grandmother I never saw, was high and it had a balcony, they made her house the headquarters, and they would play their classical music, Bach and Beethoven, on that Victrola. But when they left the village, when the Germans left, they burned a lot of the furniture and some of the houses, and in retaliation for Greek resistance. And according to my uncle, my grandmother, they started to throw the phonograph into the fire. And she said, "No, Ohi." And they threw her into the fire. Now, it's complicated because there's nobody left who really knows the story. My younger cousin, Angelo, Angie, who went there, found the gravesite, as you hear in the poem, and the grave is 1946, but bodies were interred, were exhumed and reinterned. So it's hard to know. But anyway, here's the poem. RCA Victor. It's the O in Victrola, as dark as the O in Gladiola is golden. Opens the mouth of my Uncle Shade, who tells me about the abyss and the ancient brass horn of a record player, the one who sent to his mother in Archivos, way up in the Peloponnesos, whose songs are steeped in open vowels, whose echoes I hear in polemos, my father's brother's word for war, whose O's go back to Homer, whose gift was the brute operatic music of polemos. It's the O at the end of Figaro, or a figment of my imagination, allows me to overhear those full-throated officers singing as Mozart blares from the confiscated Victor Victrola. But it's only when my uncle pronounces phonographos, the antique crankshaft revolves in my hand and sets the valley echoing with all those O's. A disc so dark, not even some golden, silver age arpeggios could lighten the shade of the olive groves. It's a month before the plastic O of the breathing tube was put in his mouth, my uncle tells me about the bonfire, just so that I know how the village glowed. It's Germans burning the furniture and some of the houses before they go. It's the muted O and gramophone and my grandmother's obdurate ghost who won't let go of the brazen O of its horn. It's the screech of the swallowed O in Phoenix and the O in the middle of immolation, that smoldering, unmollified O. And now it's the O at the end of Velcro that straps the tube to his open mouth and keeps the dying fable ablaze in my uncle's throat, unspeakable. It's my aunt from Akuvos, the only one alive who would know, saying, Ohi, Nazis no kill her. I hear she die of stroke, but me too young to know. It's those rows of oleanders leaning partisan this way, collaborant that, depending upon who swung from them. My cousin Angelo must pass below to get to Ayaya's overgrown stone, the one Oblivion's river, however the oleanders hover over the names, flows under just the same. It's the O in the ouzo that Angie pours and shows us her photos, low, of a date engraved, a date that's later than the close of the war. Yet does it denote the year of death or the atonement of reinternment, dear cousin? We toast your devotion, but drink Oblivion's river, smoky as ouzo, smoky as the ossified O of the open pit where the bones are exhumed. O revolving record on Clotho's spindle, verse needle at home in the line's dark groove. O flaming, familial, apocryphal tongues. The O in Victrola, dark as the O in Gladiola, is golden Mozart. Sing by osmosis, O muse. I should have said that Clotho, the record spinning like Clotho's spindle. Clotho's one of the three fates. They draw out the thread, spread it out, and cut it. Here's a short childhood poem. And I think it wasn't much said about some of the trauma that had sort of reverberated down through my family, but it was picked up by my brother and my cousins. I think a little bit of that is in this poem. Veil. That's V-E-I-L, veil. Caught in a sun shower on my way to school, I once took shelter by ducking under a willow. Its branches hung down so low, they swept the street. I was stepping through beaded catkins. I was stepping through beaded curtains, thick as catkins. The rainwater glittered, running down the vines. My books in their slung green satchel stirred like seedlings. Black earth, moist roots, the bowl mouth oozing tar. I could have waited things out in the candy store, but I was shy. I was the firstborn. For years, I never knew why those elderly relatives would look at me that way. They spoke no English. Their coats were heavy. Whatever they'd been through, I stepped back out from under the veil of the willow, just as the dew was shining on everything, the houses, the sidewalk, even the dark Atlantic. I think I'll read three more. The next one is, again, a poem about a fellow sufferer. When I was a graduate student, and I see my fellow student and dear friend Jim Stone in the audience, and we were at BU, I was working part-time with autistic children who were deafblind. They were severely, profoundly handicapped. Their only language was generally a few signs, eat and drink and more. And I would work part-time there, and I would go across a little bridge, and I would study with people like Derek Walcott, went on to win the Nobel Prize, Christopher Ricks, Jeffrey Hill, Rosanna Warren. You know, the tremendous power of articulation that was across the highway. But amongst those children, it was the same intensity to speak, to express. And this poem is about that. There's a reference to Asclepius, of course, the great doctor who was also the god of medicine and had a temple at Epidaurus. And Pausanias says that the people who came to be healed at night, they would lay in these animal skins, and a sacred snake would approach them and either whisper into their ear or actually go into their ear and effect a cure through their ears. The Deafblind Girl, a handbook for the soul no one can read, a veil that's watered by tears, a private school for deafblind children in Brookline, where I worked part-time with a little girl in constant agony, profoundly autistic, the one we called Antigone. She always wore a helmet, even while sleeping, because as an infant, she'd blinded herself with her fists. An orange, perforated styrofoam helmet to ward off the sleepless demons inside her head. It's one thing to sing the form, the frightened hare once left in the melting snow. Another to wince at her hair lip, whose trembling cleft will never depart. If she wasn't held or strapped to a chair with restraints, she'd batter her eyes and ears, her nose and mouth, as if she was trying to shut down all of her senses. Little Antigone, buried alive in herself. O healing god of dreams, Asclepian snake, your cure the spell that enters through our ears. Could you not slither through those cauliflowers? She signed with her hands, but only when prompted by staff, and then always the same three frantic gesticulations for eat and drink and more, as if anorexic language could only express the naked hunger it cannot feed, as it screamed through the tongues in her hands for eat and drink and more. And yet at the sink, with her tiny fists still clenched, she would stand calm for a couple of hours as the steady, warm stream kept pouring down on her hands until, like little flower buds, her tiny fists unfurled to the faucet water. Now the gush of it splashed against her outstretched palms, ecstatic stigmata, as she alternated her hands, one over the other, as though in eloquent discourse with the one who quenched her thirst, the Anne Sullivan of the shining, babbling water, the water that held her as warm as the womb of never being born. Her frizzy, unhelmeted hair, the faucet unfailing, her eyes that were never open except at the sink, her pupils like gray-blue fuses of broken bulbs. That spellbound little girl at home in the school for the deaf and blind, just standing there by a pair of gleaming knobs, and the fluent, effusive water, and looking as if she'd solved the Sphinx's riddle. It's a very short one. Let me talk about this one later. Origins. Behind the words, there is a poem. Behind the poem, there is a voice. Behind the voice, there is a breath. Behind the breath, there must be silence. Behind the silence is where the voice that speaks the poem is coming from. Inside the thirst, there is a well. Inside the well, there is no light. Inside the dark, there is an echo. Inside the echo, there must be longing. Inside the longing is where the water no bucket can hold is coming from. And the last one I'll read is Birds in Cemeteries. It must be the shade that draws them, or else the grass. And it seems they always alight away from their flocks, alone. It's so quiet here, you can't help but hear their talons clink as they hop from headstone to headstone. Their sharp, inquisitive beaks cast quizzical glances. The lawn is mown. The gate is always open. The names engraved on the stones and the uplifting words below the names are lapidary as ever. But almost never even a chirp from the birds, let alone a wild shriek as they perch on a tomb. And then they fly away, looking as if they couldn't remember why it was they came, but were doing what our souls are supposed to do on the day we die, if the birds could read the words. Thank you so much.
George, always you amaze us. Nothing of your readings is identical. It's just incredible. A lot of broken language, as you said, is full of new sources of inspiration. We open it to questions with our audience. It seems to me, George, you redefine what diasporic poetry is with all these experiences of yours.
And I appreciate that very much. I think it's, I was very fortunate in that, my parents were still, and my mother's parents were in New Bedford. They were all from sort of village cultures. And so they maintained a kind of liturgical ritual world. They weren't especially religious. I mean, they went to church, but these customs they followed very closely. And that I think I realized very quickly that world, even when I was in graduate school and I was meeting students who were my age from Greece, and who, that world was already gone. So I felt that there was, and in the great good fortune to study with Derek Walcott, and he encouraged me quite a bit to preserve as well as I could some of that world. And also I wanted to preserve the world of my teachers, who were particularly Donald Kahn Ross, who was a great classicist. So, I wanted to sort of have this sort of modern Greek blue collar dramatic world, but also the world of classical literature, which I later studied very closely with my dear friend, who's back here, David Ferry, a great poet and our greatest living translator from the Latin, and who's 98 years old, and he'll be watching this video at some point. So thank you, Vassiliki.
Yeah, there's a question.
Να ρωτήσω στα ελληνικά.
Yes.
Πρώτα να ευχαριστήσω τον αγαπητό κύριο Γεώργιο Καλογερή, αν το είπα σωστά, Καλογερής, ναι. Ενδιαφέρον πολύ, όσο μπόρεσα να κατανοήσω, καθώς στα αγγλικά μου ήταν πιο εύκολο όταν διάβαζα και το κείμενο, το ποίημα. Μου άρεσε πολύ το πρώτο τελευταίο ποίημα και όλα την ώρα, αλλά ιδιαίτερα αυτό. Μου άρεσε που είναι μια ποίηση αυτοναφορική και βιωματική με τη μνήμη και το παρελθόν και τα οικογενειακά βιώματα δηλαδή. Και επίσης μου έδωσε την αίσθηση, ένα ερώτημα είναι για το αυτιστικό παιδί και αυτό πολύ ενδιαφέρον. Τι σχέση έχετε κύριε Καλογερή με τα παιδιά με αυτισμό αν δουλεύετε? Και ένα ακόμη ερώτημα που έχω είναι όταν έκανα την έρευνά μου για τη μετανάστευση και ψυχική διαταραχή, εκεί στη βιβλιογραφία που βρήκα έλεγε ότι τα παιδιά της τρίτης γενιάς επανέρχονται και των μεταναστών, αναζητούν τις ρίζες τους. Και η ποίηση σας, κύριε Καλογερή, αυτό μου έφερε στο νου. Αν έχετε κάτι να πείτε πάνω σε αυτό.
First of all, Despina wants to congratulate you and thank you for this wonderful reading. She particularly loved the first to the last poem that you read. She noticed that your poetry is self-referential and experiential, and you weave the family experiences into your poetry. She was puzzled, she was intrigued by the poem about the autistic child, and she wanted to know whether there is any further relationship in your poetry with this kind of children. And also she has worked with immigrant children, and in her research she noticed that the children of the third generation in particular are looking for their roots and whether this applies to you. Those are this is the summary of Despina's questions, George. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Despina. Those are all excellent points. I don't have, I only have one other poem about an autistic child, but I think that experience is underneath the surface of a number of poems. That particular child was so in extremis to such a degree that it was, her presence haunted me. But there was one other, I do have a poem about one other student who was actually fascinating. He was a savant, and what he would love is for the teachers would pour a jigsaw puzzle in front of him. He's blind, and he would spend hours fitting it together and put it together. So that, you know, the sort of the struggle to speak and that artistic quality, I think, in the other one were haunted me. And I think you raise maybe the central point of my poetry, which is that these immigrants like my father who came over, the circumstances were so dire. I mean, the hunger in my father's village was awful. And they came here for opportunity, but I don't think they ever, and they worked so hard to preserve their culture. When I was growing up, we had to go to Greek school, what we called American school. My aunts would drive us from Winthrop to Lynn, which was about 40 minutes, to Greek school 3 days a week. But I don't think they ever expected that the melting pot experience, as you so precisely pointed out, lasts for about 3 generations. My brother has 3 daughters. His wife is Greek. Probably only one of them, I think, will marry Greek. And that's about the way that it works. So I think I felt some of that from my parents, but I think I feel it even more the older I get. So thank you so much. I think you're yours.
Despina, τα κατάλαβες? Did you?
Αν θες κάνει μία σύνοψη για σίγουρα.
You want to translate, Vassiliki? Go ahead.
Καταρχάς, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Δέσποινα, για αυτά τα σημεία που ήγηρες. πιστεύει ότι άγγιξε στην πηγή πολλών από τα θέματα που ρέουν υπογείως στην ποίησή του. Δεν έχει ειδική σχέση με αυτιστικά παιδιά, όμως εκείνη η εμπειρία που είχε με αυτά τα συγκεκριμένα παιδιά είναι σαν να αιμονεί στην ποίησή του. Θυμάται ο ίδιος ότι πήγαινε στο ελληνικό σχολείο, τους πήγαινε μαζί με άλλα παιδιά, η θεία του, 3 φορές την εβδομάδα από το Winthropos στο Lynn για να μάθουν τα ελληνικά και όλα αυτά έχουν περάσει στην ποίησή του. Ξέχασα κάτι άλλο?
That's it. That's good.
Το δεύτερο ερώτημα για την τρίτη γενιά των παιδιών.
Νομίζω δεν έδωσε. George, she's asking again about the third generation children. Are you in accordance with what she has found in her research that the third generation children are looking back for their roots or not?
I think if they're not, they will be. You know, I think that there's some sense that they're happily blending into an American culture, but that may change when they get older.
So, Δέσποινα, ο Γιώργος λέει και αν ακόμα δεν είναι αλήθεια αυτό, θα υπάρξει κάποια στιγμή που θα γίνει σίγουρα αυτό.
If I could comment from a Canadian perspective, I think there's much more cultural continuity in the Canadian immigrant experience than there is in the US. There wasn't the same pressure, there hasn't been the same pressure to assimilate and as there has been in the US. And immigrant children tend to retain their parents' and their grandparents' language a bit longer. There is some loss, of course, and there's a blending of languages, but there's much more of a distinct ethnic identity in Greek Canadian culture than there is in Greek American culture. But I think there also is perhaps a greater connection with the mother country.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, Peter. If I could just add one thing from my mother's side, because the Greek community, with respect to other ethnic groups, was so small, my mother's parents, who spoke no English, he had a little cheese and olive store in New Bedford, mostly Greeks and Portuguese. It was right on the wharf. And my mother went to school not knowing a word of English. And she came home extremely upset at her mother. That was possible, really early on in last century. But that kind of a Greek community, a little Greece, a little Italy kind of community. Maybe they had it in Astoria, maybe they had a little bit in Chicago, but otherwise, I think it was very difficult for that kind of closeness that you're talking about, Peter. The pressure was to assimilate. And I know Georgios has a question.
George, thank you very much for the poetry, for the reading. I have a question about the place of the immigrant past, the immigrant family past, that it seems to be a recurrent theme in your poetry. You mentioned so rightly that the experiences for so many immigrants was an experience of dire poverty, scales that perhaps middle-class people cannot understand. And through my readings also of the early Greek immigrant experience in the United States, I increasingly realize the scale of the challenges they faced. And recently I visited Colorado, a place called Ludlow, where there is a memorial about the Ludlow Massacre. Yeah. And in museums and in monuments ahead, I came across a past which was so violent, so challenging, that I had not imagined the scale of the challenges until I visited, and still I am really stymied, I'm dwarfed by the scale of challenges that the immigrants faced, some more than others. So I am confronted with the question, as an academic mostly, I am confronted with the question of how we represent the past, that its magnitude and its scale is so distant from our experiences. And I was wondering whether you are negotiating these kinds of questions in your poetry. How do you evoke an immigrant past that in many ways is so different than our present?
First of all, thank you it's an honor to have you here. Your scholarship, your poetry, your work at Erdogan, that means a lot to me. And you were mentioning the Ludlow Massacre. I remember reading a book a long time ago. It was called Buried Unsung, and it was about those Greek shop owners. It is, you know, to me, it's almost an epic story that they have. And I don't mean that as any kind of nostalgia. I mean, just from my father's experience, if you went to his village, I mean, it was being in Appalachia. I mean, how did they ever get out of there? Some tiny school. He comes to America with his brothers. They're pushcart vendors, gets drafted, can barely speak the language. And there he is in Guadalcanal, fighting in World War II, while his mother is in Greece and her house is under the control of the Nazis. So it is, I think you rightly pointed out an experience that, you know, this is the scale of it is hard to, I think it's hard to, as a poet, it's hard to grasp because you don't want to sentimentalize it. You don't want to make it into hagiography. But I think what I try to do is stay close to their language, stay close to their way of speaking, their way of expressing, and also to stay close to the things. My father with that basil leaf, blessing the house, you know, I think that brought with it all of the tremendous anxiety he must have had to ever obtain a house. And you know, I can remember when I was a little kid, we would be going somewhere in that black DeSoto, and my mother would send me back into the house to see if the stove was shut off. And then she would ask me, and I would nod my head, and then she would say, did you put your hands, in Greek, did you put your hands on all the stove rings? Because it wasn't only, and that, I have a poem about that because of the, you know, the charred houses that I saw in the villages, but also I think people who had, you know, it was the aftermath of the Depression, and they were deathly afraid of fire and losing their houses. So I don't know. I guess the only way I can answer your question is to try to stay close to the broken speech that they use, the particulars of their speech, and the things that I thought, to me, that Vassiliki had a kind of nimbus around it. You know, it was a Christian ritual that to me was almost more pagan in the way that it was trying to keep the way pagan rites do, trying to keep the curse outside of the house, so they would bless the doorways. So I don't know. I hope that answers a great question.
This is wonderful. Thank you. This is very helpful. I appreciate it.
And if I may add something here, I think another incredible way that George negotiates the representation of the past, George, is his unique mythical way. In a way, he's so steeped into the classical philology, and he has this parallel juxtaposition of concurrent events and that take on a different dimension just because he juxtaposes ancient parts with the present of Greece. So, for example, I have in my mind the poem Mycenae, George. It's just I would love for the.
Can I read that?
Yeah, I think that will give you an answer very close. How magically he ties past, distant past, recent past, present. And it's an incredible way, and it's weaved very seamlessly. And of course, it's not accidental yet, because George has translated Seferis. He has done his work on Seferis, who is famous for his own mythical way, of course.
Thank you, Vassiliki. I'll read this poem. It's Sinai Revisited. It's my earlier book is Guide to Greece. There's a lot of material, some material that was drawn from Pausanias, who was a Greek prose writer in the 2nd century of the Common Era. It's fascinating. He walked the whole of Greece, mainland Greece, and he recorded almost always the sacred sites. And he did it, it really became a tour guide for Romans. Rome had controlled Greece at the time, but it was really like he was preserving Greece. But anyway, I mention him because he had written extensively about Mycenae and the burial chambers. So this poem imagines Schliemann, who discovered Troy and also the burial chambers, reading Pausanias, and there's 4 sections. And all of that, you really don't need very little of that, but just let it wash over you. Sinai Revisited, 1. He kept going, and there's some ancient Greek phrases which I'll intersperse. He kept going back to the phrase inside the wall, convinced a cryptic passage in Pausanias led to the beehive tombs preserved in amber, if Heinrich Schliemann understood the grammar. Glory congealed, Kleos bright as the disk of the sun god Ra, the mask of Agamemnon. And was it a fluke or an omen? The text came roughly 1700 years after the fall of Troy. And here he was, consulting it as a guide, 1700 years later. From gaps in the text, he tapped dark sleep for the glint of gilded dream vessels, heard loose millennial sediment, sifted through shovels, sunk into vast and vaguely oracular lacunae. 2. An hour from Argos, my Uncle Taki's cellar or bunker, damp clay floors and hurricane lamp, the gleam of purple grapes in open bins, their juice transfused through coils of plastic tubes. Ensconced on crates, we toasted the kefalotidi, those thick rank heads of cheese suspended by strings, their goat's milk cured by hanging from the rafters. My uncle called them the kernels. Porous and moist, the breathing earthen walls of the Peloponnese, as redolent as ever that village cheese and the aftermath of the junta, as pale as ghosts, those homemade heads still floating in the dark of Uncle Taki's cellar or bunker, an hour from Argos. 3. Trenches cut at the close of the 19th century, scaffolds propped at steep angles, the site gouged out. Inside the wall, go back to an earlier entry, read it again, bear down on the relevant terms. Inside the word for wall, the sound of fate, tiki implied in tichoi, burial chambers as echo chambers, pour over periboli, the circular border enclosing a sanctuary, periboli. Under a sandy hill, parabolic passages, the convoluted plots and unsettled ashes, turning over like syntax in an hourglass. Inside the wall, beneath the earth, that burnished threshold where staunch Orestes unsheathed his hesitant blade. 4. In the famous photograph of Schliemann's Greek bride, she's wearing the jeweled headdress, necklace, and earrings, adornments from Troy, Sophia at 17. Thank you, Vassiliki, for giving me the chance to read that. It's a little complex, but it sort of moves from Schliemann trying to find the burial chambers, and he did find the Mask of Agamemnon, and then my uncle Celer, and then finally, for a moment, Orestes from Aeschylus's Agamemnon appears, and then at the end, that amazing photograph, you can find it online, of Schliemann's Greek bride, dressed in what they thought were Helen of Troy's jewelry. It might have been, who knows?
Yes, thank you. I think this gives me the motivation to revisit the poetry, read it more carefully from the angle that you pointed out. Thank you.
Wonderful. Peter, Catherine?
Has her hand up, and Jim also wanted to
Yes,
say something. Catherine?
absolutely.
George, I'm so deeply moved. Everything you read is very, very familiar to me. I think we're probably around the same age, and the mother poem, the homage and the prayer of that poem just really struck me. And then Hades, I was just caught in so many of your poems, but Hades and then Veil, the beautiful musicality and the breath. I just was in this, hypnotic state with the breath of your poems, stunning. And I wanted to mention also, I have, in what was just being spoken about, I have cousins in Thessaloniki who are, in their late 40s and early 50s now. My mother's first cousins were from the villages of northwestern Greece, Trebizitsa and Amagalis. I think I'm saying it maybe correctly. And they've had, my mother's cousins were very familiar because their parents were born there. But the children who are a little younger than me now have no desire to go back. And my core craves for those villages and to have more of that experience. And I met my grandfather's sister in Trebizitsa. She came out of a one-room stone house, and the recognition in that moment of who I was, her brother's granddaughter, was so profound. But I have found my family in Thessaloniki could care less about the village life, and I'm trying to understand that. I know, they're in the city and then they have children now, but it's a real interesting movement away from Greek village life. And that my generation, I think in the US and other Greek friends I have, we grew up, my grandparents were in Haverhill. We've tried to hold on to everything we can, but it's definitely slipping away. And, I'll tell my daughter who's in her late 20s now, go to church, have something, even though we're not real religious, it's just hold on to something, the scent of the incense, or, something that is from an ancient culture. But anyway, I just wanted to add that I don't think it's only in the US that the third generation, it's also in Greece that the village life is very, very distant from people who grew up in cities, is my experience.
That's so beautifully articulated, Catherine, sentence by sentence. I wish I could see that in a paragraph. It's you're enacting in language my own experience, and I so much appreciate it. It's validation to me that you had similar experiences and could hear the music of the poems expressing those experiences. So I really appreciate that. That's very important to me. And I think what you were saying, goes back to what Espina said earlier, that what happens after the third generation. It's interesting that they're in Greece. It's interesting that I don't know enough about this, but I get some sense that the EU is kind of blending things together into a common culture. So it's like a United States in a way, and there is a movement away. But the opposite trend is this. Always when I see those kind of ancestry.com, ads, I sort of am annoyed by them a little bit because they make everything so positive. And I think if you could really look back at your ancestors, appreciate it, but appreciate the sort of horror that history was. That's why you appreciate that, not because of some easy, oh, I had this person who was a great figure in my past. No, but I think there is this, it seems that you put your finger on something. There's this kind of cosmopolitan thing that's happened everywhere. But the other side of it is that, that ancient incense, that smell of that incense you were talking about, that I don't think people at some point, I don't think they can make sense out of their experience from my opinion, from their own generation or even the generation before. They want something more, they crave that. And when you come from a culture like the Greeks that's so rich, how can you turn your back on that? And my feeling is that will always somehow echo back in some way, and it may take a while. It may take getting older.
Right.
I don't know, but it's beautifully expressed. But thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Beautiful. And I think Jim has a question now.
Hey, Jim, great to see you.
Hey, George. Yeah. Well, I wanted to share my experience or my shared experience with George, of having met George 30 some odd years ago at BU. And I would be sitting, in Derek Walcott's, seminar, and George would come in from work, from having done the kind of work that he distills into this beautiful, and George, you should know, and I thank you for this, that poem has haunted me as well. And haunts me every time I hear it or read it. I've had occasion to hear George read the poem really ever since he first created it. And it means more now to me than it did then, even though at the time I felt the same way. I would say the same thing. And I say that too as a in psychology. So I had occasion to come very close as anyone might be able to get, although I don't know that you can get much closer to the experience than George is able to distill and then express in this, in poetry, which is really, it's as tragic as the poem is, and it doesn't get more tragic, it's also a celebration. It's a celebration of the assertion of humanity under the worst possible circumstances, which I think kind of ties so much in to what Peter, you mentioned earlier on about the confluence of grief and celebration and how blurred they get sometimes and need to get. I think the entire presentation and the exquisite translation and the even as exquisite reading of that translation from the English to the Greek, very, very difficult tasks that I know the guys have gone through. We've been there together, and
thank you so much, Jim. I remember Jim, we were both graduate students, and Jim had already, he's a terrific poet and a terrific translator besides his work as a psychologist, but he had already translated Yannis Kondos and had translated a very important essay on Seferis. And we've been back in contact, and he participated in a seminar we had, one credit seminar with David Ferry on translating, and it was a great delight to be back in contact with him.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jim, for that. And what you said about the DeafBlind Girl is, I do think there is an uplift in it, in that through the faucet water, she's having this eloquent dialogue. The water's like
right.
Dan Sullivan with Helen Keller, the great teacher, and she's found a way to, this kind of primal communication that calms her, just simply to stand for hours under warm water.
Yeah, and the poetry does it. It really, you know, I think it really distills a lot of your narrative into something that is just incredibly precious and worth, you know, revisiting time and time again.
And it's just seeing someone so insulated that way, so inside of herself so far, and yet so expressive. So thank you, James. And it does go way back to those days, almost 40 years now.
Well, thank you all for this.
Thanks.
I'd like to say one brief thing, that this being a small group, George has.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah,
Great
hi.
to see you.
Yeah, I long aspired to meet George before I ever did, because I admired his work. And now he's brought me together today with people whom I'm so happy to see. Kathy, whom I met in Greece several years ago, and Jim, whom I knew decades ago when you were translating Yanis Kondos. I'm so happy to see you again, and so happy to be present at this reading when you connect, as Vassiliki said so beautifully, the present with the past. The water from the faucet is like shining from shook foil, and it has a spiritual dimension that pervades all your poetry, I feel, although you disclaim an attachment to religion in the formal and official sense. The cultural sense and the spiritual sense, I feel to be so very strongly there. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to see you. Sarah Cavafy is a tremendous translator, wonderful poet and artist, and has also transcribed music. I'm so honored to have her as my friend, and she's helped me so much with the impossible task of transliterating Greek words, and that is invaluable to me, because you don't want the reader to have to stop and try to figure out how to pronounce them. But she's been a great guide to go. One of my guides to Greece is Sarah Cavafy. There's no question about that.
It's mutual. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, George. We're coming towards the end of our time. We do have a few more minutes. Would anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment? We wanted to mention that Citizen Tales Commons, this think tank that Vassiliki started a number of years ago and that I've been involved in since the beginning, is launching a podcast series. And George is going to be our first podcast guest. And we spent some time together in the studio a few days ago, and Vassiliki will be weaving together some of those recordings with today's experience, and we'll also make a video of today's chat available to you. And Vassiliki, could you give the link for the podcast series?
Yes, citizentales.org. And we also have a YouTube channel, which is Citizen Tales Commons YouTube channel. And that's where we put all our videos. We still have plenty to put on, including today's. And feel free to browse our mission, our members, and the join form if you want to join us. We will be happy to have you with us. I wonder, because we have a few more minutes, would it be wonderful to close with the translation of Cavafy by George, Dialogos to Achilleos?
Just while George is getting his together, I just want to mention that in our past chats, we had a wonderful hour and a half with Espina Kaitazi Huyumi, who's with us today. And I heartily encourage you to go back to our YouTube recording of that chat. It was incredibly rich and just a beautiful time together. And also last week, our chat with Hélène Cardona, who is a poet, a translator, an actress, and we had a wonderful conversation with her as well. So please look up the YouTube recordings of those talks and other ones that we've had.
I will finish with my version of Cavafy's poem, The Horses of Achilles. When the horses of Achilles turned and saw Patroclus dead, that beautiful young man, so brave and strong. They both began to weep. Suddenly that Olympian breed felt bewildered by death's outrageous display of what it is. No matter how they arch their necks and toss their wild, luxuriant manes, or stamp their hooves as if to wake him up, they couldn't shake off what they were seeing it there in the dirt, that heap of flesh and bones with the pitiful look of Patroclus. Their rider's breath was gone. Now he was nothing. Nothing now and nowhere. But now it was Zeus who was moved, and seeing all that was happening to that immortal pair, he wondered why he'd been so foolish once. Surely it would have been better, my dear sad horses, if I had never offered you as a gift at the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis. What on earth were the two of you doing down there, yoked to the cars of such pathetic creatures? Mortals are nothing but the dust at your heels. Old age and death can never catch up with the steed that flies like the wind. And yet you carry on as if men had bridled you to their misery. But those two gallant horses kept right on weeping, weeping for Patroclus, still shedding their tears as if there was no end to what they felt. If I could just say two things about it. That poem that Cavafy made out of a great moment in the Iliad, Ruskin called it the most magnificently humane passage in Western literature. The horses continue to weep. The horses are immortal horses. They were used to Achilles being their driver, were horses that could speak, and they were stunned into silence at seeing the death of a human being, and they weep over the human being. So another fellow suffering creature, those horses. Thank you so much.
George, thank you. Thank you all for your presence here today. Vassiliki, thank you so much for organizing this and for your collaboration on everything. And we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much. A big applause to George and to you.